The US education system is failing, but what can we do to fix it? If you're like most people, you think the solution is maybe we should just spend more money on education. And while I understand where you're coming from, that's actually not going to work. And I'll show you why in this video. But before we get to solutions, I first need to prove to you that the American education system is failing, if for some reason you don't believe me. Let's start by looking at the proficiency test that high school seniors have to take. If we use the most recent data available, we find that only 25% of students are proficient or better in math and 37% in reading. That means that 3 out of every 4 students are not even proficient in math. To me, that is fairly disturbing, but it gets even worse. In that same year, 38% of students were below basic achievement in math and 28% in reading. So what this means is that you have more students who are below basic achievement in math than you do who are proficient or better in math. And that is really messed up. I do not see how you can look at that and say our education system is doing well, especially when you consider the fact that the proficiency exams are things that we create, our own standards. By our own standards, we're not doing well. But it doesn't stop there, because there's a thing called grade inflation, which makes matters, in my opinion, even worse. Business Insider points out that in 1998, about 39% of high schoolers had an A average. By 2016, the rate had increased to 47%. Meanwhile, the average SAT scores fell. So in the past 20 years, students have been getting higher grades but lower test scores. And that shows that grades are not really indicative of how students are learning. If you think they are, I'm sorry, grade inflation shows that's not the case. If you need more evidence, look at this study talking about grade inflation in high schools. They found a fairly disturbing trend. Specifically, that while grade inflation occurs overall at most schools, it is more pronounced at the more affluent schools, or the schools that tend to have more resources, the richer schools, to put it bluntly. This graph shows that in just the past 10 years, grade inflation has occurred more at more affluent schools than at less affluent schools. And the issue here is probably fairly obvious. Suppose I'm going to one of those less affluent or poorer schools, I work really hard, I get a really good grade. And then I'm applying to colleges, but my GPA is being compared to students who went to more affluent schools. The issue there being that their schools tend to give out higher grades on average. It doesn't mean they're better students or they worked harder, they just have higher grades because of grade inflation. So I am less likely to get into that college because my school was not inflating grades nearly as much. That is a really big issue. And again, in case you think grades are actually indicative of what they're learning, consider the fact, as this report says, that more than 1/3 of the students who received B's from their teachers in Algebra 1 failed to score proficient on the end of course exams. So just because students are getting higher grades now than they did 10 or 20 years ago, that does not mean that they're more proficient in the material, because in many cases they're not. So hopefully you're convinced the US education system is broken. Now, how do we fix it? Well, the answer is not money. I hate to break it to you, but it's not quite that simple. You see, most people think we can just increase spending in education and we're going to do better. And while I understand where you're coming from, the data does not really support that. For example, if we compare the educational outcomes in the United States to other OECD countries, we can see highlighted here, the United States generally ranks in the mid-teens. So we're not doing horribly, but there's a good amount of room for improvement. But now if we look at how much each of those countries actually spends on education per student, the United States is near the very top. There are only a few countries that spend more than we do. So we are outspending many of these countries, and yet they're outperforming us fairly frequently. So money can't really be the solution. Now, I understand spending more money might not be a bad thing necessarily, but who wants to pay more taxes? Rather than just spend more money endlessly on education, let's instead focus on where we're spending the money. Let's reallocate our sources and make it more effective. For example, let's look at teachers' salary. If you look at the average salary of teachers in the United States and compare it to other countries around the world, whether it be elementary school teachers or high school teachers, you'll actually see that the United States ranks in the top 10 both times. So you might look at that and say that we're paying our teachers fine, we don't need to address this. But there is another part to this that we need to consider, and that is how much more teachers could make if they went into a different career. Specifically, when you do that, you find that the United States is actually lagging behind the OECD average. Essentially, this graph means that someone in the United States becoming a teacher will earn 67% of what they could have earned if they had gone to a different career with the same level of education. Consider that to Finland or Denmark or Australia, all of which have higher than 80%. And the OECD average is 79%. So becoming a teacher in the United States is not just about how much you make, it's how much you could make had you gone to a different career with the same level of education. And the issue here is that if you want to get really qualified teachers, you need to make them competitive. If you're going to lose 33% of your income by becoming a teacher, you're probably going to choose to do something else. Obviously, that's not true for everyone, and we still have a number of good teachers. But we don't have as big a pool to choose from. Just statistically speaking, we're not going to have as good teachers because they're being drawn to other careers. And deciding to do something instead of teaching because of the money is not a bad thing. I'm not saying it is. If you choose to go into a different career because you're concerned about your income, that is completely understandable. You have to provide for yourself and your family. So let's not pretend that they're just in it for the money, because money is a fairly important thing nowadays. We should just make it easier for them to choose to become a teacher so they don't have to give up quite so much. That being said, if we're going to pay teachers more, we have to make sure we have better teachers. And one of the things we need to do about this is looking at teachers' unions. Now, I'm not going to advocate for getting rid of teachers' unions completely, because I'm not going to do that. I know many of my conservative friends don't like teachers' unions. I see where they're coming from, but they also have some benefits. However, one area where they are detrimental is when it comes to firing bad teachers. Teachers agree with this overall. If we look at teachers who were surveyed, where they're asked if teachers' unions make it harder to fire bad teachers, 63% of them, whether they be unionized or non-unionized, actually agree with that. So the majority of teachers do recognize that teachers' unions make it more difficult to fire bad teachers. So that is something that needs to be addressed. If we want teaching to be a more competitive career, then it has to be competitive. Keeping bad teachers is not a way to do that. In addition to that, we need to have a way to properly evaluate how well teachers are doing. Now, this is a little bit difficult, and I'm not entirely sure of the method here, but one thing we need to do is link teacher pay to their evaluations. This study looked at over 100 districts across the United States, and they found that nearly half of the districts they sampled offer some form of performance pay based on a teacher's evaluation rating. However, there were only 16 districts where a teacher's evaluation dictated the size of their salary increase. So what that means is that in the vast majority of districts, if your pay was in fact influenced by your evaluation, you would get the same pay increase if you were marked a good teacher or a great teacher, which is really not the way it has to go. Again, if we want teaching to be competitive, then the best teachers should get the best pay. It should not be about seniority as it kind of currently is. It should be about effectiveness. And yes, I understand evaluating teachers is a bit difficult. I'm not sure the best way to do that, but we do need to try. Now at this point, you might be wondering why I said we don't have to increase taxes, and then I immediately went into let's increase teacher salary. Those two things kind of don't go together. But as a matter of fact, they can if we just look at where the money is going in the education system and we reallocate it to things that are more important. So for example, let's consider school sports. I'm not going to advocate we should get rid of sports entirely. I wouldn't do that because a lot of people actually like them. Now I know that school sports are actually positive things as well. They can teach students about teamwork and camaraderie and leadership. All of these are positive attributes, which is why I'm not saying we get rid of them entirely. But we do need to recognize that we spend more on high school sports than we really should. It's consistently found, as this article points out, that in many cases, spending in athletics is nearly double that of per pupil spending in math, science, and English. And yes, I understand a lot of people like high school football or soccer or baseball or whatever the case may be. They like their high school sports. So we don't have to get rid of it. But maybe we should put a little bit more emphasis on them fundraising for themselves. Let's just recognize where our priorities are supposed to lie. If they're with high school sports, then fine, we can continue the way we have been. But if it's in education, and we want the education system to actually properly educate our students, we need to give them more money in education, not in sports. Another way we can actually cut down on the spending is looking at technology. Now, again, I'm not saying we should get rid of technology in schools necessarily, but you have to admit there's a good amount of money spent on unnecessary technology. It's not just me saying it, there are plenty of experts who agree with this. For example, this article from the Washington Post points out that we probably have too much technology in our schools, and they highlight two very important numbers. First, 1,000. That is the number of hours that the average student in the United States spends in a classroom. 1,000 hours a year, and we'll actually see that a little bit later as well. Second, 4,000. That's the number of hours that children spend on technology every single year, ages 8 through 18. And in case you don't think it's possible, that does account for multitasking. If you're on your phone scrolling through Facebook while watching TV, it counts both of those. So because students are spending so much more time on technology, the argument here goes that school should actually be a break from the norm in a sense. That because young people spend so much time with digital media outside of schools, schools must offer them a very different kind of education in order to even the cognitive scales. Now, the argument usually goes that students need to learn about technology because we live in a technological world, and I understand that. But consider the fact that a lot of students nowadays, elementary school even, have their own iPhones and iPads, and a lot of the time they know more about technology than the teachers do. So spending money on technology that is not necessary is not the best way to go. An example of this is the push to give every student a laptop, something that Peru did a few years ago, and it didn't really work for them. Even though it cost more than $200 million, they didn't really see any positive improvements. In the United States, we have spent over $60 billion by a conservative estimate to try and increase the use of computers in schools. This study about the one-to-one initiative saying that every student should have their own computer essentially argues that it's not beneficial. That instead of spending so much money on technology and teaching teachers how to actually use that technology, instead it should address teachers' beliefs about instruction itself. You should teach teachers to be better teachers, not teach them how to use technology. Again, I'm not against technology, it certainly has its place. But if we're spending billions of dollars on technology that is not needed, why are we doing that? That could instead go to teacher salaries or any number of places. Another change I think we should make, which would eventually save us money in the long run, would be to cut down the number of hours students are actually in school. Now, we already saw, but I'm going to reiterate it right here, that in the United States, we spend about 1,000 hours in a classroom setting. And once again, we're really close to the top when you compare us to the other countries. The only countries that spend more time than us are countries like Chile, Mexico, and Costa Rica. And not to offend them or anything, but they're generally not the countries you want to be associated with when it comes to education. So we're spending more time in the classroom, spending more money at the same time, and we're not doing as well as many of these other countries. Very few studies are going to argue that spending more time in school or in the classroom is necessarily a good thing. It doesn't really work out that way. In many cases, spending more time in class does not benefit the students in any way. Now, one of the reasons this may be the case is because when they're in school, students are only on task for about 1/3 of the time they're actually there. Which means if you have a 6-hour-long school day, you're really only on task for 2 of those hours. As I already pointed out, you're not really going to find studies that link longer school days and improve test scores. Instead, what's important is not the quantity of hours, but the quality of interactions students have with teachers. So you can pile on more and more hours, it doesn't necessarily mean school's going to be better, because what's actually important is how well the teacher teaches, as we've already seen multiple times. And many countries that have shorter school years and school days have higher test scores and grades. As we already saw, the United States is at the very top of the pack when it comes to hours spent in school. So I think we could lose a few hours. I'm not saying we cut it down dramatically, but we could cut it down by an hour or 2 every single day. And not only would it make the time students spend in school more effective, it would actually save money. So some of that money could be spent in teachers' salaries to get better teachers. Now, even though this is a political channel, up to this point I haven't really been too political, but that's going to change just a little bit right here. During the campaign, Kamala Harris had some ridiculous idea to increase the school day by 3 hours. Just let that sink in for 1 second. We already spend almost 1,000 hours in school in the United States. If we were to increase that by 3 hours every single day, that would put us at 1,500 hours a year, well above any other country in the world. That is a horrible idea. Now, I understand where she's trying to come from because there are single parents who kind of want more time at work or they can't pick up their students at a specific time, and I get that. But the solution is not to make the school day longer for everybody because that's not going to work. Teachers are already, in many cases, overworked, overstressed. On the other hand, if you shorten the school day by a few hours, teachers will have more time to prepare. They'll be less stressed, and you'll probably get better lessons. So overall, I think it's worth the risk. Let's try it and see what happens. We have nothing to lose. Kind of going along with that theme, in the United States, students spend actually quite a bit more time on schoolwork inside the house than they do in many other countries. And so giving homework isn't necessarily the best idea. Again, I'm not advocating for getting rid of it completely. I understand that practice is very important, especially when it comes to things like math and physics. I mean, I'm a physics graduate student. I understand homework. But there are instances where you don't need to give out homework, especially when they're in elementary school. You don't have to give them X amount of homework every single night. Instead, we could do what was suggested here, that you eliminate homework for elementary students and replace it with 20 minutes of nightly reading. Reading every day will do more to benefit elementary school students than giving them a math worksheet or something like that. Reading is fundamental for children's learning. It's much more important than just doing some worksheet or finding some answer. If you want to learn more about why decreasing the amount of homework may actually be beneficial, check out some of the sources I have down below. I do just want to highlight the disparity in time spent on homework with the United States and many other countries. Now here I have highlighted China, which is an outlier for sure. They spend almost 14 hours on homework every week. And then we have the United States, where we spend about 6 hours every week. So that's a little bit more than an hour every single school day. Compare that, however, to Finland, where they had the least amount of homework with only 2.8 hours per week, and South Korea with 2.9 hours. As a matter of fact, the average is 4.9 hours. So in the United States, we're spending 1 hour more than the average on homework every single week. And that adds up if you look at the entire school year. Now remember Finland, where they had less than 3 hours of homework every week. Well, in spite of that, they are consistently ranked one of the best educational systems in the world. It depends on the rankings you used, but if you look at test scores here, Finland is actually at number 2, just below South Korea. And South Korea also only had 3 hours of homework every single week. Furthermore, if we look at how long the school days are in Finland, we see that they spend less than 600 hours in school every single year. Again, compared to the United States, where we spend 1,000. So if we're looking for a country to model ourselves off of, I think Finland is a good solution. Less homework, less time in school, better test scores, better teachers. Overall, it seems like a win-win. Now, I understand we can't exactly become another country. The United States is different than Finland. We're different from North Korea, from China, from all of these other countries. I recognize that. But I also think it's foolish to say that we can't do what they've already done. We should at least try it. If it's working for them, it could very easily work for us as well. And it's obvious that what we've been doing for the past decades has not worked. Our students are not doing well academically. If you compare it to the rest of the world, or even to our own proficiency tests, they're not doing well. So something needs to change. In all honesty, what do we have to lose? Obviously, I haven't addressed every issue with the American education system. I haven't even talked about standardized testing, for example, or the fact that there are too many students in a classroom in the United States. There are plenty of things that we can change, but we need to actually start somewhere. Which is why I think the best places we can start are some of the things I mentioned here. If we give teachers a higher salary, if we cut down on their hours, if we cut down on homework, we can do all of these things to save money, probably not have to raise taxes, but get significantly better teachers. And that's why I think this is the way to go. Now, maybe you're wondering why I'm trying to emphasize not spending more money on education. Now, we already saw we spend more than just about every other country in the world, and it hasn't worked. So the issue is not how much money we're spending, it's where the money is going. And because we pay taxes, I pay taxes, I don't want to just increase the taxes to try and fix the education system if it's not going to go in the right place. So yes, I think teachers having a higher salary is a good starting place. But I also think to offset that, we should cut spending elsewhere. Even if it's for a good thing like education, the system is a failure. So why should we just keep spending more and more money trying to fix it when we could address the more underlying issues? If you've made it this far, I really appreciate it. This is a long video, but I hope you learned something from it. If you have other suggestions on what we can do to fix the educational system, go ahead and let me know in the comment section below. If you disagree with one of the assessments I've made, you can let me know that too. I'd appreciate it, and in the future I'll probably do another video like this, so if you give suggestions that seem reasonable, I'll look at it and maybe incorporate it in the future. And if you've gotten this far, I'll ask you to share this video on Facebook or on Twitter or wherever you want. I'd really appreciate it, and I think the more we can learn about the education system, not just why it's broken, but how we can fix it, the better we're going to be, and the more information we know about the education system, the better we can make it. Before you take off, be sure you subscribe and that you hit the notification bell. As always, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.